Paula, thank you so much for coming. I'm such a big fan. So I want to get started by asking you about your current research interests. I know you probably have a lot, but what are one or two that you're particularly interested in right now?
Well, I mean, the thing I'm most interested in right now, and I have several projects going related to it, is risk-taking in science, or the lack of risk-taking in science. And it's something that I've spent probably the majority of my research time thinking about over the last couple of years. And given that I'm a professor emeritus, I have a lot of flexibility and time to think about it, and nobody telling me I have to bring in a grant in order to do it. So, and other than that, I spend a lot of time working on the Science of Science funding project with Reinhilde Villiger at KU Leuven for the NBER. So that's
Yeah, and
pretty much where I'm focused right now.
I attended the Science of Science funding meeting last week. I thought it was really interesting, but I want to get into the risk taking more. What got you interested in this question of risk? What drew you there?
Well, one of the I think interesting, or one of the windows that opened up for me, because, well, let me just back up a second.
Sure.
I'm trained as an economist, and I ended up really focusing on the economics of science and on labor market issues in science. And that led me to doing lots of work with a database in the United States called the Survey of Doctorate Recipients, which is a longitudinal survey of scientists. And it turned out that the late Sharon Levin, who I worked with for a very long period of time, and I were the only people who had had access to that data outside of the National Science Foundation, which is a whole nother story as to what I think is a real issue, that this data is not readily available. So anyhow, my work with this data, by the late 1990s, people who were on National Academy of Science committees knew that I knew about this data and had some access to this data, and I started serving on committees. So I think I've just agreed to be on either my 14th or 15th National Academy committee. And one of the great virtues of that is that you spend a lot of time with scientists and people totally outside your field, and you begin to hear people talk about issues, and you begin to think about issues in different ways. And then in 2006, I was appointed to the advisory committee or advisory council for the National Institutes of Health, NIGMS Institute, which is the Basic Science Institute. And so the more I was involved with this and reading and looking at the way grants were made, increasingly I got interested in the lack of risk-taking in science, I think, and the way both incentives discourage risk-taking, and the way in which funders, I think, basically are, as funding has gotten so big, they kind of insure themselves against funding projects that may not work out. So it's just, and then I met, I'm working with 3 people in Europe related to this. One's Reinhilde Villiger at KU Leuven, and Jean Wang, who's at the University of Leiden. And Jean is a whiz in bibliometrics, and we worked on this concept of novelty, and we published on the issue of the relationship of novelty to citations and impact factors. And we believe novelty, while it's not a measure of risk, we think it's extremely correlated with risk. And then right now, Reinhilde and Jean and I have gotten data from the European Research Council. So we have data on every person they've funded. We know who they are, and we know when they went up for review. And then we have a sample of, I think it's about 20% of people who weren't funded. It's It's a very
Hmm.
large group who've been considered, over 60,000 now, I believe. So, and we can compute their novelty profile
Hmm.
before they went up for grants, and we can see how that affects the decision about them. So I'm working on that, and I'll be happy to tell you more about that and how we're doing that. And
Yeah.
then, and then one of the really wonderful benefits of working in this area is that about 16 years ago, a young researcher from Italy um, met me at a conference, and she said she had funding to come to the US as a postdoc fellow. And with her funding, could she come to Georgia State? And we talked for a long time, and she came, and her name's Chiara Franzoni. And it's been a great pleasure to work with her over the last 16 years. And, you know, that's how I met Cindy and Danny at experiment.com,
Right.
was
Yeah.
because Chiara and Henry Sauerman, who was another colleague of mine at Georgia Tech, got
Yeah.
together and were interested in studying experiment.com. But anyhow, Chiara is extremely interested in really thinking about what risk-taking in science means. Everybody
Yeah.
talks about it, but
Hmm.
but we think nobody's really drilled down to what it all means. And
Hmm.
so we've spent a long time. She's now at Politecnico di Milano,
Yeah.
and I try to go to Milan for about 2 to 3 weeks a year. And
Hmm.
we've been talking about risk taking and discussing it for a long time. And now we have a paper which will turn into an NBER working paper very soon, which is kind of a review of what we see um, as what the meaning of what risk means in science. And
Interesting.
and it's been lots and lots of fun to think about, and it turns out to be much more complicated than one would think. Okay, so
Yeah. Oh,
that's been
I
great. So that's what I'm spending this summer. That's what I'm spending most of my time on.
well, that's interesting. So, a few things. I have one kind of comment and then one question. So, um, your book, I have to plug your book if anyone hasn't read
Oh,
it,
thank you.
How Economics Shape Science. I
I
recommend it.
have to tell you, look at my
Oh,
son-in-law.
wow.
My son-in-law
Got you
gave
the
me
mouse.
gave me a mouse about 6 years ago for Christmas. So he keeps me company
I love
because
it.
in my family that book is referred to as the mouse. So.
Well, it's fantastic. I recommend it all the time. It comes up in almost all of my interviews. You know, if you think about every great
Thank you.
detective movie, or you think about investigative reporting in general, the first rule for all the best investigators is follow the money.
Right.
And you did that. And this book, I think, is exhaustive. I stopped highlighting it because it was all underlined and highlighted. It's so dense and interesting and informative. And it's interesting to me that after you've done all of that work, that the most important next issue that you found is risk taking. So I think that signals a lot. And when I think about risk taking, when I hear about the kind of novelty profiles that you've just described and how difficult I imagine it to be, one question I have for you is, one of the things I'm learning through these interviews is that there's this genre of scientists who are leaving academia to either start companies or do independent research because they believe that's going to have a bigger um, impact on the world. When you think about novelty, are you finding ways to bring in uh, scores and metrics outside of citations and papers, or is it is that what it's based on?
Well, I mean, first of all, there are two issues here. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to return to your comment about people leaving. Okay.
Mm,
Because,
sure,
but let's let's talk about that in a few minutes.
sure.
I mean, there are two issues. One is, how did we construct the measure of novelty? And
Mm-hmm.
then how do we evaluate its effects? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the way we constructed novelty is that we looked at all the, every article has references in it. So we looked at the references in an article, and then we looked at the pairing of each reference with another reference in the article, and we looked at whether that pairing had ever occurred before in published articles in the last 20 years. And if it had never occurred before, we called it novel. It's a combination of two pieces of knowledge that, at least in published work, hadn't occurred before. And then we looked at how difficult it was to make by looking at, in a sense, whether those two connected references had common friends. Were they likely to have been cited in other journal articles with each other? And so we found out that, and we did this for over 1 million articles. And we chose to do it for 2001 because we wanted to look at what happened to these articles going forward. And we found that 89% of all articles do not have any novel combinations. And then the largest percent have 1 or 2 novel combinations, and then just a small number are highly novel, is what we called it. And so in this work that I noticed it's cited, there's a link to it in that Vox piece you sent me.
Yeah.
Okay. This came out in Research Policy, and also the Nature had a comment about it that we wrote for Nature. Anyway, it is, well, first of all, let me say that we think this measure, while it doesn't measure risk, and there's so many different elements to risk, which we can talk about in just a few minutes, but we think that it has characteristics that we think of coming with risk, such as a higher mean value in terms of citations, but also a much higher variance. So articles are either more likely to be highly cited or just about get virtually no citations that are highly. And so that's what we think about risk, right? In financial terms, we think about that riskier things have a higher variance associated with them, but the expected value is higher. So I think the thing that really was most impressive about this then is that if you look at citations to these highly novel papers compared to citations to non-novel or just moderately novel, in the end, and when I mean the end, over a period of 15 years, they're much, much more likely to be highly cited. But in the very near term, like 1 to 3 years, they are not. They seem to be penalized, okay? Or they don't draw attention. And that may well be because a lot of the citing articles come from outside their field, okay? And it may take a while for people to learn about them. Also, we found that they're in lower impact journals. Journal impact factor is a way of measuring, which we could go on and on about the problems with that. But so what this showed is that in the very short run, classic bibliometric measures seem to have a bias against novelty. Okay?
Yeah.
And given, particularly for early careers, the incredible importance of short-term bibliometric measures, one could, connect some dots here and see this as discouraging risk-taking. Okay? Because think about it. Hirings for young faculty member are totally based on whether you have an article, or highly based on whether you have an article in a top journal impact factor. And for third-year review, people consistently look at citations. And for promotion, people look at citations. I did evaluation last year for the Italian university system or whatever, and you have to evaluate people's articles. And of course, they all come with bibliometric measures. And that's going to determine who's eligible for promotion. That's very, very common throughout Europe, and it's, of course, exceedingly common in the US. And so in this more recent research that Reinhilde and Jean Wang and I are doing, we got all this data from the ERC. And while we do not have the proposal, so we can't tell you the novelty of the proposal, we can tell you the novelty of all the publications of the researcher prior to going up for review at the ERC. So, you know, let me just explain that the ERC is the biggest funding mechanism in Europe for scientists. And it has three kinds of programs. It has a program for starters. Those are people who I think have been out at most 5 years from their PhD. And it has a consolidator program. Those are for people who've been out 5 to 11 years, I believe. And then it has the senior advanced program, okay? The consolidator program has kind of been on and off, so we don't have that much data for it, but we have good data for the starters and the advanced grants. And really interestingly, we find that the people with novel research are much, much less likely to get a grant if in the starting program. That there seems to be something in the review process, and it's, you know, we don't know exactly why, that they get screened out during that.
So novel ideas tend.
Well, people with a history of novel research are less likely to be funded. Okay.
But that trends towards at the beginning.
That's for the starters. That's for the early career. And we don't find it for the senior people, which is interesting, I think. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing is this review process is in 2 stages. So the first stage you only see, and I've done this kind of review for ERC, you see a 5-page summary of the research and you get to see the person's CV. And then if they pass that stage, you get to see the full proposal, the same CV, and a handful of them will be invited back for interviews. Okay. And where we found that it seemed to pay, the penalty seemed to be the strongest was at that first stage, which kind of suggests that bibliometrics are playing an awfully important role, right? And that people are kind of voting on looking on Google Scholar or something like that to decide whether they're going to let somebody advance. And that when they get the whole proposal maybe, and they've been winnowed down so you don't have 100 to look at, but you only have 15 to look at or something. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but that perhaps they're better at judging the strength of the research. I can't really tell you that for sure, but okay. And this is for a lot of money. We're talking about these grants are for like 5 years and 2 million euros. They're not, this is not small change. So, so that's the project we're working on right now, which is, we think, quite exciting. We were interested in seeing if the people who actually get a grant, whether the grant, because it's for a long period of time and it's for a lot of money, you shouldn't have to go looking for more money for a while.
Right.
We thought that might encourage the risk taking, you know? I mean, we don't find evidence of that for the senior people. We cannot, it doesn't suggest that. But what is interesting, and this is really depressing, is the people who were turned down, who were had a history of novel research. In the next few years, they do less novel research. It's almost as though they got the message that they need to play it safe. So that's a kind of discouraging implication. And once again, we find that for these young researchers. Okay.
Interesting. Have you incorporated any kind of data sets connecting those to patents or anything outside of bibliometrics, or is it still primarily just a
No, this is
research?
still primarily bibliometrics. I mean, that'd be a very interesting thing to do. And there are people who've done work in thinking about whether patents are novel in terms of the technologies that
Right.
are brought to bear. Lee
Right.
Fleming in
Yeah.
California has done a lot of work in that regard. And
Yep.
Reinhold has done some work in that regard. But we haven't done anything like that. And we also haven't, I mean, this would be pretty easy to do. You know, there are a number of altmetric measures that we could incorporate in and
Yep.
look at, but we haven't
Yep.
done that. Okay.
Great. So it sounds like there's still a lot to do. That's great.
Oh yeah,
Well,
there's
that's
definitely, and I think there's a huge amount to do in terms of really being able to get a good grasp on how to measure risk taking in science.
yeah.
I mean,
So
that's
yeah, well, that's great. I think it's really interesting. I'm gonna look up your novelty profiles and make sure there's a link so people can read the paper and check it out. You said you wanted to address my comment about people leaving academia.
oh well. I mean, do you know if it's at a greater rate than in the past? I mean, you know,
No.
it's easy to get these examples and to talk to people, but the economist in me and you know, my ears go up and I think,
Yeah.
oh, because I mean, I think that there's been a long history of people, you know, there's some movement, but I
Hmm.
would believe that it's certainly academic careers are certainly more challenging today, I think, than they were 50 years ago or 40
Yeah.
years ago or 30 years ago. On
Right.
the other hand, um, big industry has certainly not been hiring. So I would think that these are smaller firms or entrepreneurial
Uh,
opportunities.
yeah, and I was just referring to kind of anecdotal entrepreneurs. My
Right.
hypothesis in the kind of the bigger stats are, based on, something I heard in your meta science talk, like the way that the current training schema where we have, professors training a lot of folks for small jobs. I think that has, and just the relatively kind of static amount of funding in science, not, of course, there's been the NIH bumps and things like that. But I just think that more and more students are going to have to leave just because there isn't the
Oh,
jobs in
absolutely.
academia.
And you know,
But
the pandemic's going to make that much worse, I think.
yeah, well, so I think my perspective is really is different because I'm, as a non-scientist, like I'm not trained as a scientist, but someone who's interested, like a parascientist, a
Mm-hmm.
science groupie. Um, I don't play. I view the grand endeavor of science as the the pursuit of knowledge and the ability to make society and life better for folks.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, for me, the game of trying to get a paper published doesn't matter. So I look at the whole big picture and I'm interested in participating from almost an amateur perspective, from a just a place of pure curiosity. And so for me, I don't see the game the same way that researchers see the game. And I think there's more, what I'm finding, and it could just be because of approaching the issue like that I'm meeting a number of academics, and Cindy and Denny, who started Experiment, are a good example, who are kind of opting out of the typical advancement through a career where you publish papers, you try and get tenure, all that stuff, and saying, we're interested in this grand endeavor, and we think the best way to pursue that is to build tools. And that's their lens. And I tend to agree with them. But I think more and more people are I'm meeting more people who agree with that thesis and are taking those routes. And the interesting thing about those folks is there's not a clear path for them, right? Like it's not like a steady advancement. Here you get tenure and do this. Everyone's making their way on that, and they have to make their own path. And so I've been really interested in those folks
Mm-hmm.
because I think they're all trying different things and trying this different way. So
Sure. Sure.
that's my defense of what I'm seeing.
I know, I think that's really interesting. I mean, and really important. Science doing research is expensive
Yeah.
or requires access to some resources.
Yeah.
And typically people have seen you have to have a ticket to get those resources, and that ticket has come for people doing work of kind of a basic or semi-basic nature. That's typically been in academia, and
Hmm.
you have to get funding to do that.
Hmm.
Um, I think we know those positions are getting, the probability of getting one of those positions has declined a great deal as the number of PhDs has grown. And that's partly because universities are risk averse
Hmm.
and it's expensive to hire a new faculty member, and it takes a lot of startup funds, et cetera. So I think the reality is that a lot of people who want to do science may be turned off by that, but they also may realize that they're not going to really be able to do any independent work in academia because it's very unlikely they'll get that kind of position.
Yeah.
So I think there's a real interest in alternative ways to to help such people be productive, and for them to investigate alternative paths.
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely. I
and
think,
and I've been very supportive of that. Although um, I think we've yet to see that it can bear a lot of fruit, but I certainly think it's very worthwhile exploring and supporting.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, absolutely. Here, here. I agree. Um, okay, so I could go on and on asking you questions about this, but I'd love to jump to the next section of the interview, the research mode. I want to know how you work. I was just struck reading your book, um, just the breadth and the depth. And what I loved about it is it wasn't just data. I thought you pulled an incredible amount of nuance out of the lives of scientists. And you had a bunch of great stories that went along with kind of the bigger data picture that you're painting. And so I want to know how you read papers. What do you look for? Where do you find the the stories that bring the data to life?
Well, I have to tell you that my late husband was a sociologist, and he always said, and he helped me a great deal in editing the book, I have to say, but he always said that maybe he should have been the economist and I should have been the sociologist, because
Huh.
I love talking with people and I love listening to people, and I love thinking about, well, I don't know. Sometimes I think I have kind of a framework in my head of where pieces might fit together. And then
Uh-huh.
I'm at places or listening to people or reading. And I think, oh my gosh, that's a perfect example of what I've been thinking about. And it leads me to start looking at other examples. And now it's ancient history because I finished the book 10 years ago, or 9 years ago. But when I was doing the book, I had incredible number of clippings. It was before it was, I just had files and files of clippings of different examples. I thought I just threw them out. I moved a year ago and I finally threw out all these boxes of clippings. But I found them very helpful in
Mm-hmm.
thinking about things. And then I've been incredibly fortunate to serve on all these National Academy committees and also advisory groups in Europe and on NIGMS. And you meet people and you start
Mm-hmm.
talking to them and you hear things, and you think, like, I became very interested in protein structure when
Mm-hmm.
I was at NIGMS, because at the time I was at NIGMS on their advisory council, we were putting $70 million a year into protein structure, which is a
Hmm.
lot of money as a country just through NIGMS. And everybody kept talking about how mechanized it become and all the robots involved. And I mean, that was news to me, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so through connections there, I ended up visiting a lab that was doing a lot of work on protein structure and learned something about how all the robotics that had evolved. And I'm just giving that as an example. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't think I would have ever even thought about that if I hadn't been on the NIGMS advisory committee. Or you came to the Science of Science funding, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and so I'm now on the SUNY Research Council Advisory Board, and the head of the the head of Brookhaven, which is a huge lab out on Long Island, is a member of that, and we've developed a relationship, and I invited him to be on that panel. And
Hmm.
it turned out he had to present his budget to DOE the next day, so he accepted, but then he had to turn it down. And instead, John Hall, who manages that synchrotron, the #2 light source,
Yeah.
was on, and I thought it was terrific. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
people really enjoyed that presentation. And as another example, Greg Petsko, who gave the overview talk.
Yeah.
I mean, how did I meet Greg? I met him because he chaired the postdoc, Rethinking the Postdoc Committee 10 years ago
Right.
at the National Academy.
Right.
And he and I just really, he's terrific, and he's taught me a lot about protein structure also. So
Mm-hmm.
I think I've been very fortunate to work with people like this and develop relationships. And I just commented on a paper on protein structure on another NVER session, and Greg and I spent an hour talking about that paper. And it's just, I think those meeting people, talking with people, thinking about examples outside your field, that's been incredibly helpful for me. And it's fun. I mean, it's
Yeah.
what I like doing. I'm a gregarious person, and I like meeting people, and I like thinking about where things kind of fit in. So I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
does that kind of answer your question?
It does. Yeah. And so, what does that look like? Are you reading? Do you print out the papers? Like, how does this all live? So I
Well,
understand the conversations.
the
But
conversations are, I keep little notes for myself, kind of. I
okay.
mean, and it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
My current work on risk,
Yeah.
this was a lot of fun. 2 years ago, I guess. Somebody at the Kellogg School, Dashan
Yeah.
Wong at the Kellogg School at Northwestern,
Yeah.
invited me to come give a seminar, and he said it didn't have to be a formal paper. It could just be to talk about something that interested me right then.
Yeah.
So I decided, Kiara and I'd been talking some about risk, so I decided to give a presentation on the meaning of risk in science. I
Mm-hmm.
hadn't really, that's what really got me thinking about it.
Hmm.
And doing more reading. And then I put together, I have a Dropbox. Well, I think I'm organized in some ways and not very organized in another. But
Hmm.
I started putting together, just in a long Word document, thoughts I had about risk and links to papers, etc. And then Kiara and I would talk for a long time, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So those are all in a Dropbox. I work with Dropboxes because I want to share them with co-authors. And
So can I ask you a question about the Google Docs? So is that just a personal? So you almost start writing for yourself, even though you don't have it figured out. Like you're trying to outline it there for yourself. Is that how it works?
right, or I kind of write out little pieces of it,
Okay.
what I think. I mean, like in risk, I start thinking about, oh, well, let's think about how incentives affect this. And then
Okay.
let's think about how peer review affects this. And let's think about how bibliometrics affect this,
Got it.
etc. Okay. But
Yeah.
then Kiara has really been terrific at pushing everybody, I think,
Yeah.
to think about what risk really means.
Yeah.
And let me just give you an example. So
Yeah.
let's see, this pandemic's made it hard for me to keep track of time. But I
Yeah.
think
Me
it
too.
was a year ago that Kiara and I decided to send out, let me back up and say that one of the things I did before I got involved in risk, soon
Yeah.
after the book came out, Kiara and Beppe Shalato, another colleague who I've worked with who's at Politecnico de Torino, we did a large, I've always been interested in migration of scientists and the mobility of scientists,
Right.
particularly international mobility. So
Hmm.
we did a survey that we called, if you're Italian, you call it the Globe Chi survey, you call it the Globe Sci survey if you're from the US. And we surveyed, I think, 49,000 corresponding authors on publications in 4 fields to find out mobility patterns, et cetera. And we got a 40% response rate, which is huge for that kind of survey.
Hmm.
And we had a lot of data. That data, anybody can now get that data. It's deposited at the NBER. But we worked for at least 3.5 years on papers based on that data and on giving talks based on that data. So Kiara and I were so, we thought, hey, if we got a 40% response rate to the Globe
Yeah.
Chi survey, we can turn around and survey scientists about their attitudes towards risk and whether they take on risky projects. This was
Yeah.
quite naive of us. First of all, I think it's very, very hard to survey people now. People have gotten savvy. To answer our survey in 2011 was one thing. To answer a survey today, you get much, much lower response rates. Our
Interesting.
response rate was, and I'm not the only person who's found this out, okay? So our response rate was something like 8 or 9%. But the interesting thing is, and this was for the field of immunology, I think, we'd gotten a colleague of Kiara's helped her put together a good list of people to survey. But the irony is that an awful lot of these people, when they saw the word risk, and these were all publishing scientists, they just thought about whether somebody was going to die or be injured in the lab, which
So it's
wasn't
like a
exactly
definitional problem.
right, which wasn't exactly what we were thinking about with regard to
Right. Right.
risk.
Well, that came up in the meta science talk too. I mean, a few of the questions were, as the folks actually were thinking about risk in an entirely different way. And so I think just the definition is really important.
I think that's really, really true. And of course, one thing that Kiara and I find interesting, and I think it's fun to think about, is that, lots of institutions try to protect themselves from risk, right?
Yeah.
So one way universities outsource risk, I think.
Yeah.
The fact that, you have to have, and so do funding agencies. So you have to have IRB approval, right? In order, before you can
Sure.
put in a proposal or anything. But furthermore, does the university do the IRB approval? No, they hire a company to manage their IRB. They're outsourcing it, okay? So, and I think that's kind of an interesting example. And it used to be that funding organizations, of course, would have directly thought about risk. No, they're having the university certify it through this external group they've hired.
Yeah.
And so it's just pushing the risk out of the picture. And I really think that universities outsource risk by hiring people in soft money positions, so they can just get rid of them if they don't bring in more money, and they're not stuck with them. So I think universities have become masters or work very hard at outsourcing risk.
Interesting, like the financial system almost, that's
Absolutely.
trying to abstract it away.
Well, I think they've learned.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, yeah. Interesting. So risk goes kind of hand in hand with responsibility then.
In
of
some sense, right.
Interesting. By any chance, do you have this Microsoft doc? I'd love to see it if you
No,
have like the
actually,
initial notes.
oh, well, this is really embarrassing. Let's see.
You should be
How
able
am
to
I going
share
to
if you have
do
it.
this? I know I should have opened it up.
No problem. Take your time. You can cut this out.
Let's see.
I just love to see how those initial notes come out because I think they're so illuminating.
Let's see, where is it? Oh, here it must be. Okay.
And then it's almost 11, so I don't know if you have a hard stop or.
No, I don't. Oh, I just seem to have lost you. How do I get back to you? Huh. Are you still there?
I'm still here.
Well, I seem to have lost you. Let's see. Oh, there you are. So now let me go to share my screen, share screen. Huh. Okay. Supposed to be doing.
Yep.
Do you see?
Yeah.
Okay, so see, these are notes I started taking. And you see that I don't even label them very well. I mean, if there's one thing I should do is clean up my act, but I'm not good at cleaning up my act.
So you're just putting, are these papers that you're finding, or are these
some
that
of
you're
them are
writing?
papers, but some of them are like notes on risk. Let's see. Please move this window away from the shared application. What does that mean? Let's see if it's going to open. I have a very old. You see, it's just kind of a outline, right?
It's not showing up for me. Maybe it's.
Oh, it's not showing up for you.
No. But I'd love to see it.
Okay, so let's go back. So what's, it says, please move this window away from the shared application. I don't know why. Who knows? Okay, let's go. Here, maybe I've got it now. Here, let's see. Maybe you can see it now. Can you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, you see it's just, I mean, it's all kinds of ways. It's very disorganized, okay?
Well, I think it's interesting. So you're just kind of listing ideas that you want to dig into
and
more.
Where is the risk? And I mean, all kinds of things, okay? I haven't looked at.
and happy lab animals.
Happy lab animals, okay?
That's important.
I don't know. I'm always interested in mice. I'm tremendously interested in mice. And you know, by the way, you know, that's another example of risk. This is very interesting. You know, once genetically modified risk became, once genetically modified mice became so important in research, a lot of labs were creating their own mice, okay?
Interesting.
But it takes about, and I presume, I haven't read up or talked to anybody about this for about 3 years, but it takes about a year to go through all the steps to genetically modify a mouse, to get the mouse you want, to get the knockout or knock-in mouse.
Yeah.
I assume that's still true because of just the gestation time, et cetera, involved. So a lot of labs could hire a postdoc to do that, and they'd come up empty at the end of a year because something went wrong. So you can now order your mouse. You've been able to order your genetically modified mouse for quite a while from a place in China. And I'm sure there are other places. And you are, quote, guaranteed a mouse in 39 weeks. Or maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's 48. And you pay about, when I talked to this company, you pay about $38,000 to do it. And it's guaranteed in the sense that they preserve it as it goes along in different stages. So if something fails, you may not get it in the stated time, but you'll get it much faster than you would have gotten it if it had all failed in your lab.
Wow.
Apparently. But see, that's a kind of insurance too, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's interesting. I'm hearing about like companies that are starting that are just like huge amounts of mice. And they've got cameras and people it's like Amazon Web Services for mice. Anyways, I haven't seen it.
Oh, that's very interesting. Oh, that's very interesting.
but it kind of gets into what you were talking about tools, which I think is actually an understudied part of your
Oh,
book. I think that
completely understudied.
and also really interesting
And terribly hard to get good data on, by the
it
way.
is, yeah. And but I think you can look at, there's such a strong um, a strong like story to be told if you look at the history of science, that the costs of tools and the access to tools is a huge driver of question asking.
Well,
And
look at my favorite book right now. I mean,
aha,
do you know about the telescope in the ice?
I don't, and I'm going to
Oh,
write
well,
this down and
you
read
should
it.
really read this.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the Neutrino Observatory that's at South Pole,
Yep.
or at Pole as it's referred to.
Yeah.
And this is really the brainchild. Look at all my
Yeah.
markers in the book.
That's like your book for me.
This is the brainchild of a man by the name of Francis Halzon, who's a physicist, astronomer at the University of Wisconsin. And he, I became absolutely intrigued by this, and I do mention it in the book, when at a conference in Japan, one of the organizers in 2010, I think, invited Halzon to come and talk about the project. And then we all had dinner with him, and it was a small group, maybe 10 of us, and Chiara was there as well. And it's just fascinating, and it involves an incredible amount of risk. It's a neutrino observatory that is embedded in the ice, and they had to drill down. It's 1,000 meters. It doesn't even begin until 1,000 meters below the ice because there's so many bubbles in the ice. And then they go 1.5 kilometers below that and embed a string of sensors. And these sensors can pick up neutrinos. And it took over 10 years to embed all these sensors. And the risk involved is just incredible at all kinds of levels. So Chiara and I are using it as an example to talk about risk in our paper, which is lots of fun. And after I hadn't read about it for a while, and then I found out that this man, Mark Bowen, who's a physicist, had funding, I think, from some foundation to become a part of the project, and he ended up writing a book about it.
Wow.
And it's really it's quite intriguing. It's really intriguing.
All right.
Anyhow, so
I'll read it.
That's an example, because reading something like this makes me think about, I read this book, I didn't get this book till last December. And I've gone back to it right now in writing this draft with Chiara, and it just raises all kinds of issues with regard to risk. And you can see just perfect examples of ways to cope with risk. For example, this is an expensive project, and right after NSF decided to fund the bigger part of it, Bush put all new projects on hold, and they were suddenly completely no funds to do it.
Wow.
And it costs a lot of money to fly this equipment into the South Pole. And you also have a narrow window of getting it in. And the University of Wisconsin loaned them $4 million.
Wow.
And just advanced it to them. Now that helps you take risk, right?
That's a gutsy institutional move.
But also the University of Wisconsin has the WARF fund. You know about WARF? Because
I went to the University of Wisconsin.
Yeah, so okay. Yeah. I mean, it's a great institution. I mean, and WARF was able to help with some of this. So I think that's another example of having resources. There was some place to get the resources fast to do it.
Sure, totally.
So anyhow, that's just a minor example. Okay.
Well, that's cool. Yeah, that's really, I'm going to read the book. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I think you'd like it, particularly if you're a Wisconsin person.
Yeah.
And Francis Halzon's from Belgium, so given that I spend a lot of time in Belgium, that's nice. Also.
Oh, cool. Cool. Well, I want to wrap up by asking you kind of a question that I already know you have a lot of answers to, which is, how can we make science better? And I'm going to link to your meta science talk where you actually listed, I think, I don't know, 8 or
Oh, I
dozen
forget what I listed.
really interesting ideas. And I think they're all really specific tests that we should be running and we should be implementing. But if you had to pick one or two, what are the most
Hmm.
important ideas you think the world needs to know about how to make science better?
Well, I can't remember if I mentioned this at the Meta Science Conference. I need to go back and look. But I think science, particularly university science, is really, really being damaged by the great, great focus on rankings. I think it's just really, really damaging to science. It's been because rankings are pretty much based on bibliometrics,
Mm-hmm.
and universities are just absolutely obsessed with rankings. And
Mm-hmm.
universities in Europe are absolutely obsessed with rankings. It's just not the US.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they see their revenue based on it. They see rankings important in attracting international students at the undergraduate level and at the master's level where they get their money. Um, and I just think if you go back to what I said about novelty,
Mm-hmm.
if rankings are based on bibliometrics and they almost are exclusively based
Mm-hmm.
on bibliometrics or on prizes, it's just really, really damaging to the system. I think
Hmm.
it's been incredibly damaging to the system. And I think in the US, of course, the amount of funding you get is the other thing that affects rankings just a tremendous amount. Okay.
Interesting.
So, so I think that we have really,
Should we do away with them, or should we have a different way of comparing or rewarding risk and progress?
well, this is not just risk, this is like
Right.
universities being obsessed as to whether they come in 18th on this list or 20th on this list,
Right.
and putting huge amount of resources into trying to move up in the rankings. And I just think it's just not a good use of resources. In
Interesting.
France, there's been a huge reorganization of the university system because the French just about had a, I spend a lot of time in France, so no
Yeah.
one should take this personally, but I mean, it was so shattering to the French that their university didn't rank top. And when they thought about it, they decided it's because they were all too small. So they put all this effort into combining institutions. Now, that may use up a lot of energy. Who knows if that's efficient? But you don't want to do it just because of the rankings. It
Right.
seems to be rather ill conceived. And that's the kind of things I think that this drives. And that's
So
why I think faculty get a huge amount of pressure, by the way, also, to bring in funding, because universities rankings in the US depend on whether you're a member of the AAU, that's the American Association of Universities, which is
mm-hmm.
a really exclusive club. And you can't belong unless you have a great deal of federal funding from NIH and NSF and a couple of other places.
Hmm.
And so universities desperately look for that. In my own state, the University of Georgia, which is a good institution, has
Mm-hmm.
never been a member, and they think they're not a member because they don't have a medical school or didn't. And most NIH funding goes to medical schools. So they have the goal of starting a medical school really for the precise reason to move up and to get to be an AAU institution. And I just think that shows you the perverse incentives. But I can't remember going back to, I should have looked at what I said at the Meta Science conference, but I just think we have got to start. I think grading people on bibliometrics measures is just, um, is really, really hampering the scientific
Well,
enterprise.
that,
I really
well,
think so.
that comes up a lot, and I hear that from people I'm talking to, that the bibliometric process is perverting a lot of
Absolutely.
the directions of people's curiosity. And but what's interesting about what you just said about rankings is that is not a recommendation for department heads and researchers. that is a recommendation for administrators. Uh,
Absolutely.
and I think that's interesting that you're looking even, I don't even say it's higher up the chain, but you're looking, with your lens of following the money. And I think it's a great idea, and I appreciate the recommendation and the idea. Well, that's it. I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to following along with your novelty research and staying in touch.
Well, it's been lots of fun talking to you, and I really wish you the best of luck with experiment.com. I think it's a great platform. Okay?
All right. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Ciao.